I'm Ron Amundsen. If you don't know me, I'm the Chair of Environmental Science Policy and Management. And it's a real honor for me today to introduce Garrison Sposito as our 2011 Ponziani Lecturer. First, I want to begin with a little historical context. The study of soils in American universities began here on the Berkeley campus with the arrival of Eugene Hilgard, well over 100 years ago. By the force of his vision and personality, Hilgard launched a new discipline of soil science and shepherded the College of Agriculture to state and national prominence. In those simpler times, Hilgard was internationally recognized as a geologist, an agricultural chemist, an agronomist, and when he arrived at Berkeley, his command of languages was exceeded only by the then professor of German. It's thus understandable that buildings, streets, mountains in California are named in honor of Professor Hilgard. It might seem in our present time of expanding intellectual boundaries and disciplinary specialization that we'll never see a polymath like Hilgard, yet I would argue that Gary Sposito is just that. He's without question the world's most respected soil chemist. He's widely acknowledged for his fundamental research and breakthroughs in soil physics and hydrology, and he's written textbooks on physics, and yes, his command of languages probably exceeds or equals that of Hilgard. Gary first arrived here in Berkeley, the Berkeley campus in 1963, a student of modest means from the University of Arizona. Upon his arrival, he began his PhD research under the direction of Kenneth Babcock, and 22 months later completed his dissertation on the theory of clay-water interactions. The short duration of his studies forced him to apply for a waiver of the university's 2-year residency requirement for a PhD. Yet, upon his graduation, no soil science position was awaiting him, so Gary instead accepted a position as an assistant professor of physics at Sonoma State University. On the basis of his teaching and scholarly work, Gary was quickly promoted. He authored during that period a text on quantum mechanics in 1970 and classical dynamics in 1973. In the mid-1970s, then a full professor of physics, Gary applied for the position of assistant professor of soil chemistry at UC Riverside. His application was initially shelved because it was assumed by the chair that Gary would not seriously consider becoming a non-tenured faculty member again. However, due to the fortuitous intervention of Professor Frank Bingham, one of Ponziani's former students, Gary was ultimately interviewed and hired, thus launching one of the most remarkable careers in environmental sciences. In 1988, Gary returned to Berkeley as a member of the Department of Soil Science, which is now part of Environmental Science Policy and Management. Gary's career has been devoted to understanding what he has sometimes called the Great Inland Sea, the water that exists in the pores of the Earth's soils, the chemical reactions that occur between the water and the soil solids, and the tides and currents that transport this water through the soil to the underground and beyond. He has written numerous foundational books and has published more than 600 research articles. He has been named a fellow in 6 scientific societies. He's been designated a legend in environmental chemistry by the American Chemical Society. And a few years ago, his colleagues and former students organized a symposium in his honor at the American Chemical Society. It lasted for 4 days. I want to make a few personal comments about Gary's influence on both myself and on Berkeley. I was a graduate student at Riverside for part of Gary's tenure. What struck me at that time was that I was watching Gary raise an intellectual bar, both for the Riverside campus and for soil science as a profession. He seemed to be showing that research on soil was not some provincial activity, but one that could both inform and influence all other arenas of science. I also became aware that Berkeley had a great importance to him. When I received my present job offer, Gary invited me out for coffee to talk about the great tradition of the Berkeley campus and the enormous expectations and responsibilities associated with it. I think it had the unintended effect of making me think that Berkeley had somehow hired the wrong person. Finally, from my experiences with Gary here at Berkeley, I want to say that Gary is a great colleague, one who teaches far more than his fair share, someone who faithfully serves across the campus, one who can be counted on for sage and inspirational advice. When this Berkeley institution sometimes drives me towards frustration, I walk by his office and read a tiny quote by Pascal that he has pinned to his bulletin board. The quotation says, "The sole source of man's unhappiness is that he does not know how to stay quietly in his room." I'll end my introduction by noting that just a little over a year ago, we hosted a member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in this room. But today for me is obviously in a somewhat different way, an equally signature event. Please join me in welcoming Gary Sposito.
Can you hear me? Is it okay? Okay, good. Let's see. Thank you, Ron. Thank you very much. I do want to thank Ron for letting me give this talk. It's certainly a pleasure to be with all of you and to have a chance to talk about Hans Jenny with you. I did know Hans when I was a grad student here. It's true. He was a very stern professor. He suffered no nonsense, and at that time, there are a lot of differences between what a grad student had to do then and now to get through. And one of them was that you had to have a thesis defense, that you did have that. And the professors all came, and Hans sat right in the front row and asked me some very difficult questions because my thesis topic was actually the same as his at Zurich, although some 40 years later. So he was quite interested and so forth. After that, as Ron indicated, I went off to make a living, and Hans and I began to interact again closely about 30 years ago when we exchanged letters for various reasons, having to do partly with the history of soil chemistry, but for other reasons as well. And then, as Ron has also said, in 1988, I came up here to join the faculty, and Hans and I became quite close again. I did, however, have the honor of being one of the speakers at his 85th birthday celebration, which was held here at Berkeley in 1984. I came up for that. I remember that being quite a nice day. So we had this interaction, and I'm going to show you some things. I have a number of things from Hans that I want to share with you, including some handwritten materials that you may find interesting. Try to fish these out here before things get started. So let me tell you some things about Hans Jenny. I'm going to begin with a prologue. Oh, could we have the lights, unless you're going to go blind or something with the lights off? Yeah, is that okay? Yeah, it's fine. It makes it easier to see the slides. I want to begin with a prologue because those of people who knew Hans know that there are two passions in his life that really drove him in all of his work. And you should be aware of these before we start talking about his work itself, which I certainly will do. And one of them was art. He came from a family of artists. His grandfathers were artists. His uncles and aunts were artists. They were artists, and art was a great passion of Hans's. And particularly, he loved the colors that go with the soils. Now we'd say of the Mediterranean climate. He called it his Mediterranean earth palette. And in particular, he loved the paintings of Cézanne. This is one of them, in fact. But he loved Cézanne's work. And in his famous lecture on the image of soil in landscape art, he mentions how much he loves Cézanne's work and how the Barnes Foundation, which has been located outside of Philadelphia, was a wonderful resource. That's true. I've been there, and it's an amazing collection, idiosyncratic but amazing collection of paintings. There are almost 50 Cézannes there. So, I mean, if you like Cézanne, this is the place to go. But you can see Cézanne's colors are these colors that are associated also with soils in tropical regions, in particular in soils of the Midwest, of the Southeast that are colored like this. I don't know if you can see this, but you can get an idea probably of the colors from a distance. This is actually the cover of a book which I co-edited with Bob Reginato some years ago on research opportunities in basic soil science. And for the cover, we use this batik called Solitude 2. This is made from dyes that come from the soil clays in Alabama. These are ultisols, and these are the colors of the ultisols. These are the colors that Hans loved for these. This book, by the way, is dedicated to Hans. He had passed away shortly before it came out. So these are the colors that he loved, the soil colors, and art is an abiding influence in his life, including to the extent that I think it's fair to say he did essentially all of his own illustrations for all of his books. You'll see one or two of them today, but if you look in his books, you will see this, to my mind, inimitable style, and it's him. He drew all of the pictures. The other thing that you need to know about Hans is his great love of agriculture. This is the Greek word for farming, georgia. So it's a soft G. In the Roman alphabet, it's the name of a state, which is very near Alabama, Georgia, in other words. Georgia means farming. And the great epic poem about farming is Virgil's 4 poems, the Georgics. They are amazing poems. And they are worth reading at any time. These are basically practical guides as to how to farm, but they're written in this gorgeous poetic language. And Virgil was a mature poet at the time that he did this. I'm showing you here 2 translations into English. One is the old Fairclough translation, which is a prose version and gives us the name of the title of the talk here. Now give we place to the genius of soils. And the other is David Ferry's much more recent poetic translation. Unlike the original hexameters, he actually translated, if you read this to yourself, it's in iambic pentameter because he couldn't deal with the hexameter in English. He just didn't know how to do it. But it's a beautiful poem this way too, although it's a little more practical sounding. And so you can see that this is the same Latin being translated 2 different ways. I want also to let you take a look here at this. This is the comment that he follows it with about the strengths, color, and what each is best at bringing forth. First of all, he has a whole litany of these things. Where the ground's intractable and the soil's unwelcoming, with thorns in the field, the earth a thin white clay with a lot of gravel, such a terrain is pleased with Minerva's grove of hardy, tenacious, long-lived olive trees. And that the implication there for farming is that this is a soil which is probably not much good for anything else, and so you can plant olives on it. And he mentions Minerva's grove. Those of you who know something about Roman mythology may know that Minerva is the goddess of wisdom, she is the goddess of business, she is the goddess of the arts, she is the goddess of just about everything good for human society. She got into a contest with her brother. Now I should tell you this is in her Greek form. Her name in Greek mythology is Athena. And she got into a big battle with her brother over who would have Attica. And ultimately she put her version of what was good for the world, because her father, Jupiter, said, put forth what you think would be the best for mankind. And she put forth the olive tree. She created the olive tree, and we associate Minerva with the creation of olives in mythology. Minerva is also associated with the owl for wisdom. Athena, that's the genus of owls. And as you probably know, it's Minerva you'll find on the California Great Seal with wisdom to preside over the state. So this is celebrating agriculture. When Hans was in grade school, his family moved, and they moved near a farm that was owned by his grandparents, I believe. And he grew up on a farm then, and he learned agriculture, and it really made a big, big influence on him. He loved it. And later he went to school, and he got his degree in agriculture, actually, in college. And so he had an abiding interest in agriculture, and this is what motivated him to learn more about soils and soil chemistry, was he wanted to do or understand agriculture better. So that's the other big passion in Hans's life, is art and agriculture. Just keep those in mind as you think about him. And now we come to the presentation. This is Hans, if those of you haven't seen a picture of him. This is at retirement. Clear intelligence in those eyes is very apparent. This is one of Hans's favorite paintings. It's called Arbor Day by Grant Wood. Grant Wood is quite famous. He lived in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He is famous because of a painting he made of his sister Nan, along with a family friend, called American Gothic, which he was having a good deal of fun with. This one, however, was meant to be quite serious, this painting, Arbor Day. Arbor Day was last Friday, by the way, right? Arbor Day was last Friday. So this is very timely. Why did Hans love this picture? Besides the fact that it celebrates education and planting trees, which we know to be a very good way to sequester carbon, he loved it because of this soil profile. It's right here. He said, this rich soil profile. He said, look at that. That's gorgeous. That's a wonderful Iowan mollisol being shown there in all of its glory. And he just loved this painting. This painting was made in 1932, right at the time the Depression was really hitting home in this country. And as Ron has said in this wonderful biography of Hans that he's done, short biography, 1932 was a tough time. Hans was teaching as an assistant professor at the University of Missouri at that time in a relevant department. They were probably called agronomy, I would imagine, because that's a Midwestern school. Times were tough, and so they had furloughs, and they imposed furloughs on the faculty. The faculty at Missouri was told, each of you has to take a 1-year furlough, 1 year without pay so we can make ends meet. So Hans was spared until the end because he was an assistant professor, but he had to do this. Well, a friend of his was on sabbatical at UC Davis, which was a relatively new part of the university, and he said, I heard there's a job that you can get, at least for a year, down at the Citrus Experiment Station at Riverside. And so in 1934, when Hans had to take his 1-year furlough, he went to Riverside. And there he worked with Walter Kelly, Albert Vansalo, and a number of other people who went on to do great things in soils. And he really benefited from that. And Kelly said to him, he said a couple of things to him, but one of the things he said to him was, Hans, you should come to the University of California. You would do well here. And so, in fact, ultimately he did. 2 years later, there was a job opening in the plant nutrition department here, Dennis Hoagland's department. And Hans took that job, and he, of course, remained here until the end of his life as a professor. He came here in that department to teach colloid chemistry and about soils, and he had a wonderful life here. But he came out because of an accident. It's another example of how there are opportunities in crisis. He had to make a living for himself and his family, and he took whatever came along. Now, Hans's most famous work is The Factors of Soil Formation, which is a book published. This is its 70th anniversary. The book was published 70 years ago this year. And what you're looking at on the right, on the left, I have it right here, is a 1941 ad for the book. This is an ad for The Factors of Soil Formation. Look at that book price, $3.50 for a hardback. That's not too bad. And you can see here it's extolling what's in there. It's soil formation. What part is played by time, parent materials, topography, climate, organisms? This is, in fact, a little picture of Atriplex growing on a salt-affected soil, which is part of the chapter on organisms, in fact. So here's the book. And this book made him world famous, and it was very, very controversial. It still is controversial. In it is the famous Clort equation, as students came to call it. That is to say, he put out the idea that the properties of soils could be understood quantitatively in terms of what he called soil-forming factors. And for him, there were 5 of them: climate, organisms, topography, which is R is for relief, topography, parent material, and time. And he says in the 1941 book, he says the other quote in 1989 here is coming from his oral history, which is well worth looking at as well. In the 41 book, he points out that Dukochev in Russia had said there ought to be a quantitative way of relating these factors under which soils form to the soil properties, but he didn't come up with an equation per se that could be resolved or could be understood in some quantitative sense, and the Factors of Soil Formation set about doing that, and Hans became world famous for this. These factors of soil formation are part of the K-12 curriculum right now in California for environmental science and science students in general. They are a part of the soil taxonomy system in the USDA, particularly climate, parent material, and time. They are part of the fabric of that. They are also part of the fertility capability classification system, which is now widely used to evaluate soils in developing countries. That system starts with the soil forming factors and then takes it into much more quantitative steps to assess soils for their ability to grow certain kinds of crops and so forth. Pretty much what Virgil is talking about in his poem. So this is a major work, and Hans will be forever known for this work. It's his claim to fame. Here's another view of it. This is one of Hans's drawings. It's from a paper done by Hans and Ron 20 years ago. That's right, 20 years ago. And here it's enlarged a bit. He's actually including the ecosystem as well as or I should say the above ground ecosystem as well as the soil and the factors. But here they are in Hans's own inimitable style. And this is a soil profile. Those of you who haven't seen a soil profile talked about scientifically, this is a picture of one, drawing of one. It's actually from the article on soil I did for Encyclopedia Britannica some years ago. And it shows you this gradation you saw in the painting, and the horizons, the layers, if you like, have names and so forth. And the unit here that USDA likes is a pedon. Hans did not care for that name. He preferred the name tessera, which a tessera, this is an example right here. This is a Roman mosaic found in the south of France near the Rhone River. It was actually a series. There's over a dozen of them showing the seasons of the year and the things that people did in those seasons. And this one's entitled Autumn Harvesting Apples. And you can see the tessera all over the place in there. They're the little cubes that make up the mosaic itself. And that's exactly what he had in mind when he talked about a tessera. And the reason that he preferred tessera was because, first of all, it could include both above and below ground, as you're seeing right here. But secondly, unlike the pedon, it wasn't like a unit cell in a crystal. It wasn't like the landscape soil is a lot of replicates of the same thing. His tessera could vary. So they could be one way, one place, one way another. So they had variability in them. He said that's how real soils are. And in his book, written, or rather published when he was 81 years old, The Soil Resource, his last book, he mentions this point, that he thinks it's a better idea. So I wanted you to know about that too. And again, you see the inspiration of art here. He loved mosaics as well. Now, there was one aspect of the factors of soil formation that caused a huge controversy, which goes on until right now. The book that you, I guess you were the editor along with another person of the retrospective on Hans's work, Factors of Soil Formation. The people who are writing in there talk about this. They say that the biotic factor or the organisms factor seems to be a major problem. There's an issue there. And the reason has to do with dependencies. Like, okay, well, a vegetation that grows on a soil seems like that's influenced by the soil. So how can vegetation be a factor of soil formation? These factors are supposed to be independent. Climate, time, and so forth. Climate and time are independent factors. So also are relief. It's not dependent on, well, you could imagine a way it could be dependent on climate, but only in a very, very vague sense. So, and parent material certainly is not dependent on climate. So what's this business with putting in the vegetation and so forth? So this was very controversial, and Hans was very affected by it right up until the end of his life. He always was thinking about this and trying to refute people's statements that he had it wrong, that there shouldn't be anything like that in there. Now, the larger field that's gone on since is called plant-soil feedback, and I've given you here a couple of quotes from recent papers. This is from Annual Reviews of Environment and Resources of 2005, which discusses the concept of plant-soil feedback. And what you can see here is the soil basically represented as a lot of boxes for the biota and the biogeochemistry and the physical aspects, and then the plant interacting with it, or plants, if you like, the vegetation interacting with it. And what I want you to take from this is that this field, despite there being lots of studies, in fact, this is a meta-analysis of all the studies available as of 2008. Those studies now numbers more than 300 different experiments on plant-soil feedbacks. They're inconclusive. And partly they're inconclusive because they've been done in greenhouses, which is not a great idea. I mean, greenhouses are fine, but they're greenhouses. And one has to go to the field to understand these things. And Hans always felt that. So even these folks point this out as, and not only that, but because grasses are easy to study, people study them. And so there's not much going on with regard to trees and all kinds of other plants and so forth. So there's a limitation here. And Hans was actually referring to another diagram in this 1958 paper on the organism or the plants as a biotic factor. His showed climate influencing both soil and plant, but otherwise it's like this diagram. And it's this reversible arrow that bothers people, because some people would say, well, it only goes up. And Hans, you're trying to say it goes down. But you know it goes up too. It does, for sure. And there's a dilemma there. There's a problem. Like which is the chicken, which is the egg? What should we say? Now, as I mentioned, toward the end of his life, Hans was still very worried about this. And in fact, he asked me to write an article for the Journal of the California Native Plant Society, Fremontia, which I did do and was published in 1992. And we really collaborated on that, even though he was very near the end of his life. And he left with me a set of his own notes about what he thought about plants and organisms as the state factor. It's in his own inimitable handwriting. And in one of the sections that he gave me, he said, just do whatever you want with this. So if you don't, you can trash it or you can use it or whatever. But he said, I just want you to know what I think. And this is his mature thinking, because he was 91 years old, 92 years old. One of his sections is called The Dilemma of Interactions. To isolate quantitatively the effects of plants on soils requires a lot of conceptual thought. And he talks about how plant roots, for example, can exude compounds that will influence the soil. And those compounds in turn might, in fact, cause nutrients to flow into the plant. For example, plants can exude protons, hydrogen ions, which will cause calcium or magnesium, let's say, or potassium to come into the plant. And he says, so what's going on there? Do we say that the plant influences the soil with those protons, but then it's getting the condition of the soil in the first place to provide the calcium and magnesium is sort of already there. So maybe the soil's really conditioning what the plant did there. How do we know? So it's a problem. He could see that it was a problem. And somehow this had to be resolved. And so he did try to resolve it. He felt that a lot of writers, including Peter Batusik, said, well, you know what? We don't know. We just don't know. And some people feel that's the end of the story, that there isn't much more to say than we don't know. The two seem to be mutually influencing one another, and it's just a problem. Here's another part from that same set of notes I just showed you. Here he's showing the state factor approach again here. Here are the 5 factors: organisms, plant species, and he's talking about them being the flora, a list of species that cover an area or might be in an area. And here is the plant, which was in the previous diagram, going back and forth at double arrow in soil properties. And what he says here is originally the relation, he didn't have time to stick in the references. I told him, let me have the notes. I don't care about the references to a paper published in 1951, but it doesn't matter. Originally the relationship had been designed for soil, but Major demonstrated its validity for vegetation. Fine. This is the important part. For plant species, organisms refers to the flora, a soil plus the seeds and germules that reach from the outside. Reach it from the outside. Let's see, still correcting stuff. It is the potential vegetation, the potential vegetation. Soil and vegetation and its airspace are the ecosystem. So he's starting to distinguish between vegetation and flora. So he's talking about the seeds. Just think about seeds, the germules. That's an old-fashioned word. I think he means the microbes there. That's all I can figure out. Little germs, if you look it up in a dictionary. It's an old word. The seeds. What he's saying is the seeds that come into an area, the soil doesn't control that. The soil doesn't control the seeds that come into an area. So that's what we're talking about. That's the potential vegetation. The actual vegetation is what grows. And according to Virgil, we can figure that out just by looking at the soil. By the way, I should mention this too. Yeah, this is worth, I have David Ferry's translation right here. The mosaic you saw, by the way, is on the front of Ferry's translation. I'd certainly urge you to, if you care at all about agriculture, this is wonderful, especially if you're a soils person, it's about beekeeping and growing wine, all that. Here's what Virgil said. He goes on about soils. He says, a rich black soil that's crumbling even before the pressure of the plowshare is felt upon it. A soil like that is almost always the best for growing grain. So he's got in mind the rich mollisol that we saw in the Arbor Day painting there. And of course, we know in the Midwest that wheat and corn grow well on those soils. So he's already giving that advice. That's the prevailing wisdom. You look for the soil and then you suit the plant to it. The idea of a plant affecting the soil is a new concept. That's different. Well, what Hans is saying, okay, what I'm talking about is the rain, R-A-I-N, the rain of species onto the soil through the seeds. Those are all the possibilities the soil has to grow plants. So that's like the rainfall that comes in. And the soil doesn't control the rainfall. Now, what the soil does control is the so-called effective rainfall. If you're into hydrology, like I am, you know what that means. That's the part of the rainfall that turns out to become runoff or causes erosion. That's the so-called effective rainfall, because some of it just goes away. That's what he means too. So the vegetation is the effective biotic factor, the one that's transformed by soil, he says, and the rain, R-A-I-N, of species onto a soil is in fact what he means by the organism factor. Here are some of his own words in talking more about flora versus vegetation. This is from his 89, from his 89 oral history. But here, what I want you to see is the following. According to botanists, the flora is a list of species, how many species are named. The vegetation refers to the biomass, or tall or short, or what color, shapes, good shape, not good shape, etc. This would be the vegetation. And he goes on and says something very important here, because we need to explore this. Now he's getting technical with us. It would be what the botanists call the phenotype compared to the genotype for the flora. The soil is not going to affect the genotypes of the seeds that I put on or that are blown in. And in the 1958 paper, he has several illustrations like this, where he imagines thought experiments. German-speaking peoples love thought experiments. That's one of their favorite ways to think about science. So he imagines a situation where everything is identical, the same climate, it's all controlled, excuse me, the same parent material, the same time, everything the same, except on one soil in this giant flower box, and there are giant flower boxes around. They're called lysimeters. There's a huge set of these down in the San Dimas Experimental Forest, which in fact was built during the WPA, Works Progress Administration. What a great organization that was. If you look at the preface to Factors of Soil Formation, you will see this book was funded in part by the Works Progress Administration. What an amazing idea that was. Get people to work. This has happened during the Depression. Get them working on infrastructure to do things. So they set up these lysimeters. They have trees on them, they have shrubs on them, they have nothing on them, and they grow out of doors. They're big too, and people have been studying them, the people at Riverside in particular, for many, many years, very profitably. So he had that in mind. He said, if you have grass on there or a legume on there, you're going to get a different soil after 50 years. He said, that's what I'm talking about. See, because here I've controlled the organism factor here. I've controlled it there. You'll get different soil from different organisms. Now here, on this one, grass isn't allowed. On this one, the legumes aren't allowed. So that's a control. It's a thought experiment, because in the field, of course, you can't necessarily do that kind of thing. But that's what he has in mind. So I thought, I don't know the audience's background here, so I thought I should step back for just a minute and talk about these terms. So phenotype refers then, these are simple definitions, nothing too complicated. The observable traits of an organism. So you're looking at me, you're looking at my phenotype, right? And all the things about me. The genotype, though, is all or part of the genome of an organism. So that refers to something much more fundamental in terms of genes, in terms of something called a genome. Then genome is all the genetic information in an organism. This comes from the Greek word meaning to be born, ginomai. So I'm going to give you an example. Now, this is a person known as Craig Venter. Craig Venter is a very interesting person. He's a synthetic biologist. He lives down in San Diego now. He is a very interesting person. He has blue eyes, he has fair skin, he's losing his hair. And you get this look on his face. Do you get the idea that he might be called the bad boy of synthetic biology? You're right. You're right. And he was kind of ticked off because he didn't win in the race to synthesize or to put together the human genome. And so he went out and sequenced his own. That's what you're looking at right here. This is actually a full diploid genome. So now here's the genotype, and it's now not being one of these, I would say this is a classic type A person, right? Okay, so I don't think you can read these, but I can read them to you. So let's see what it says. Evening preference. There's some genes for evening preference. Substance abuse, here that is. Let's take a look here. Blue eyes, fair skin, that's good. This one says antisocial behavior, bad conduct. That's good. Novelty-seeking personality, evening preference. Did I say that one already? Heart attacks, hypertension. What else? So here it is. The genes. They told me I might do this, and they're right. If I step on this and it all goes away, then everybody goes home early. So here it is, and this is what you hope will happen, that the genes tell you the phenotype. They look like they're working. This is the one I like the best, you can't tell, but it says brown, sticky, wet earwax right here, which now you know something about Craig Venter that you didn't know before. So this is what biologists mean when they talk about genotype and phenotype. The idea is that maybe the genotype is linked to the phenotype, the observable traits are linked. But Hans is using these words in another way. First of all, this applies to organisms, like Craig Venter. So that's not what Hans is saying. He's saying something else because he's talking about really communities, even more than populations. And so clearly there's something else. And I feel that what he was saying was metaphorical here, that he meant the manifest property or the manifest characteristics of plants that you see after they grow in soil versus the genetic information that their seeds bring, or the genetic content, I should better say, that their seeds bring. I don't know whether he literally means genotype and phenotype. So we'll have to leave it at that for the moment. And now, hopefully very briefly here, right along, I think, I want to bring you to the other extreme. This is a work by Hans that deserves to be well known. I think it's a monument in the history of science myself. It's a paper he published in 1968 in the well-known journal called basically it's called the Various Publications of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences in Rome. It's the Pope's Academy of Sciences. And he published the paper there, and he never really extolled the paper or proselytized for it in the way that I think he should have, but I think it's an amazing piece of work. I have a copy I got from Hans right here, a reprint of it. It is really an amazing read. Now, what did he set out to do? First of all, he had an enormous opportunity. He had run a transect over the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, where he sampled nearly 100 soils. And out of those soils, he was looking at mainly a change in moisture. And he realized he had an opportunity once and for all to test his equation, because he had a huge number of samples and he had variabilities of all kinds. So I'm going to take you through that very briefly. So the climate, he knew the precip ranged from 8 to 20. Temperature is a smaller range. The flora turns out to be just pines and grass, basically. Topography is controlled. The parent material is igneous rocks, but they're either acidic or basic. And time, he didn't know it exactly, but he knew that it was similar for all of the samples. I'm going to try to move quickly here. Just to give you the idea, so we're talking about a transect which begins here just south of Bakersfield and runs along the Sierras all the way up to about there. And in particular, notice the light green parts which run along here. That's a transition zone, as it turns out, between 23 and 30 inches of rain per year, in which both pines and grass coexisted. Otherwise, the more rain there was, you saw pines. The less rain, you saw grass. And the first thing he was able to show, and this is from the paper, is that the texture of the soil, which means it's clay, silt, and sand content, was different according to parent material. So was the carbon. These are averages over the whole 100 samples. Carbon and nitrogen. Bases is the old word for calcium, magnesium, sodium, potassium. And then he says 1 pC of clay minerals. Pc is not this. It is not PC in the social science sense either. Hans realized that these 25, or actually 29 soil properties that they were measuring for all these soils could be in fact correlated to one another. What he wanted to do was to show a statistical relationship, doing what we call multivariate statistics. You just use the 5 factors of soil formation as the variates and then try to predict the soil properties using linear regression, statistical analysis. And he realized that some of the properties had to be correlated, like acidity might be correlated with carbon and so on and so on. And so he, realizing this, he partnered with a young grad student named Jim Wallace. And he said, how can we handle this? And Wallace had heard of, and it was just starting at that time, an approach called principal component analysis. And this is an approach by which you can take problems like this and turn it into one where the quantities you're looking at as the independent variables are combinations of the original soil properties. Now, I've looked in the literature very, very extensively over the last couple of weeks. I cannot find an earlier paper that uses principal component analysis in soil work. There are papers in 69 and 70 and so forth. I think this is the very first publication ever to use it for understanding soils. He didn't make a big deal out of it. Jim Wallace, whom I knew, actually, I knew him later. After he was later than I was in grad school, but I met him once because he's in hydrology. He went to work for IBM Watson Center in New York. There, in 1968, he met a guy named Benoit Mandelbrot, and together they published the first paper on fractals in hydrology. Mandelbrot founded the field of fractals in '67 with a paper called How Long is the Coastline of Britain? And Wallace knew enough of stat and other kinds of things that were good for the combination, so they worked on a problem called Hurst phenomenon in hydrology. So Jim knew his stat, and clearly he's the one who did this work. So here's the first paper to use principal components analysis. Now the other thing to see is in this transition zone that the carbon-nitrogen ratio, just the amount of carbon in the soil to the amount of nitrogen, is clearly different depending upon what type of vegetation there is. And so it's also true for several of these others. The precip is staying the same, and of course the temperature is the same. And this is actually from the book, The Soil Resource, but this shows you what's going on here. So if you might just, if you were naive, you would just regress precipitation linearly with carbon-nitrogen ratio. You can get a result that way. But if you look carefully, of course, it looks like the pines and grasses are lining up. And so if you do the full regression with a factor for the biotic factor, a 1 or a 0, depending on whether it's pine or grass, you get a much higher correlation. And of course, that's what you've got here really are two different ones. So each one is creating a different kind of soil. And remember, these are biotic factor because they had both equal access to this region, and the soil favored both of them. And finally, he was able to show that through using the soil forming factors, he could account for 94% of the variability of the percentage of acidic cations on the soil particle surfaces. These are hydrogen and aluminum ions. The carbon-nitrogen 82%, pH 80%, and so forth. And he was just joyful about this. He pointed out that this was really wonderful. Remember, he's regressing on climate, organisms, parent material, topography, and time. That's all. And he's able to predict this much. And so what he says here, we believe that the data and tables, there were two other tables like this, constitute the first complete solution of his Clorpt equation. So this paper contains the first time that Jenny ever was able to solve quantitatively his own equation. It's coming some 30 years after the original publication. So for that alone, I think it deserves a great deal of credit. It's really a gem. It's really a gem to read. And it's very exciting to see the excitement of the authors as they go along and say, whoa, we did it, we did it. High five. Now, after Hans retired, he really made a different direction in his work. He began to get very interested in conserving soils and conserving landscapes that had unique soils. And in fact, he got busy with his wife, Jean, and they worked very hard and were successful. Here are three of the areas that they were able to persuade organizations, let's say, to save. One of them is the Jug Handle State Reserve up by Mendocino, where the pygmy forest is. The Jepson Prairie, which has this great constable sky above it here, this particular time. So actually this year would be like this year because there's a lot of water. And the Mount Shasta mud flows. Hans and Jean were honored for this work. They were made fellows of the California Native Plant Society in '81. Hans received an award from the Soil Conservation Society. They received awards from the Nature Conservancy for all of this work. They were amazing to watch doing this. Jean she was someone who didn't take no for an answer. She just persisted all the time. I actually worked with her in trying to get the then Vice President for Agriculture to create a monument out of Hilgard's first field station. Hilgard was the person who created the first agricultural field station in the United States, and it's up in the Sierra foothills. But someone else had bought it, and they were growing dope on it, so there was all sorts of issues. She was not successful there, but most of the time she was very successful. And what Hans said in '84 in a little interview called "My Friend the Soil" is, while reverence for soil was not explicitly invoked in front of the people that did this, made the decisions, it helped sustain the efforts to secure these lands. This is part of a memorial statement that Ron and I wrote together in 1992, and here's the ending of it, which I think is very appropriate. This is an invitation to come to the part of the pygmy forest that's now called the Hans Jenny Pygmy Forest, which is still being developed, even as we speak. Few of us are fortunate enough to have our lives touched by contact with a man of the personal charm and genius that belonged to Hans Jenny. Our intellectual debt to him is enormous for the way that he changed forever the science in which he chose to specialize, and for the inspiring facets of his personal example. To this, however, we must add the gratitude of our children and theirs for his crowning achievements in helping to protect our precious endowment of soil resources throughout the ages to come. He thought about future generations. I wanted to close with just a couple of words about that. What we're talking about here is what's called the public good. The public good. Here are some quotes. Here, let's go back to Virgil. This, I think, is from the Aeneid. The noblest motive is the public good. Here's what Benjamin Wheeler said in his inaugural address, one of the great presidents of the University of California. The supreme purpose of the university is to provide living beings for the service of society. Robert Gordon Sproul, in his inaugural address, another great president of the University of California. The university is of the people and for the people, not in any low or unworthy sense, but in the highest and noblest relations to the intellectual and moral well-being. Hans himself weighing in on this in his oral history. Today, the idea of stewardship of land is pitted against the belief in soil exploitation for personal gain, and the soil is merely an economic commodity in the marketplace. I place soils on a par with art museums. Here he's also echoing sentiments of Aldo Leopold, whom many of you may know in terms of that. And I like this quote from Paul Hawkins' commencement address at the University of Portland 2 years ago. He's got it all together there. So it's not about making money. It's about doing something for the public good, something that matters for people in general. And finally, I came across this paper by an agricultural economist at Iowa State in which he talks about the land-grant ethic. It's what I've called it too. The land-grant ethic says this. It says, we do research in this state university for the people of California, and we give it away to them. That's what cooperative extension is about. That's what farm advisors are about. We give it away for the public good. So it comes down to a question primarily of who is our constituency? Is it students, the future generations who will benefit from the great body of transmitted knowledge, and indeed all of society? Or will the constituency be narrowed with a focus on a relatively small group of peers and large private sector firms with almost imperceptible attention to students, to the transmission of culture, and to those in society who have benefited so much from their land-grant universities? That choice is being made as we speak today. So I'd like to leave you with that thought. You know, the theme of this year's Cal Day was public service. It was about public service and what students could do after they left Berkeley to create the public good. I think that's a really good idea. That's the ethic I was brought up in and still continue to be. My background isn't all that different from Hans's in many ways. So I thank you for your attention. Hans thanks you for your attention. And you can look at this little poem that someone wrote about him at the end of his life. Thank you very much.
I'm going to open it up for questions in just a moment. We'll stay here until a quarter after or so if you have questions. But first I want to give Gary this memento of his talk. I want to tell Gary probably knows about the
I don't know what that is.
On the front of this is a little sketch. You can look at this if you want to come down afterwards. It's a drawing that Hans Jenny made in 1927, and it's a picture of a plane with a windmill in Kansas, and this sort of a sky arcing over the top. And this is, when Hans came to the United States in 1927, he had the opportunity to go on a transcontinental soil excursion as part of the first International Congress of Soil Science. And by his own admission, he was kind of a cocky, smart-ass young scientist, and he went on this trip. And while he was traveling across the country with all these preeminent scientists, it dawned on him that as they crossed these vast gradients of climate and geography, that mathematics could describe the relations that he saw traveling across the landscape. And in his notes, or in his oral history, he said that at nights he could hardly sleep thinking about the opportunity to go back, go through the libraries, put data together, and write mathematical equations to explain what he had been seeing on his trip. And so this is his attempt. He said one of the hardest things for him to do was to draw the Great Plains. And so this is his attempt at drawing the plains, a picture of Kansas that he drew, and we put this on the plaque for Gary. So.
Thank you very much. It's heavy, I'll tell you that.
Now, does anybody have any questions for Gary? Yes, John.
All right, so this might be a proverbial question, but we've been talking about this since I was an undergrad, and it was presumably a GRE question. And the question was, which one is the most important soil forming factor?
Well, if you look at the USDA taxonomy, they would tell you that climate is. Because the soil orders are the highest level of the soil taxonomy. The order is to soils what the biome is to terrestrial ecosystems. And as you know, those are very much organized on the basis of climate primarily. So they would say that climate is an overriding factor. But clearly the system is also based on time. We have soils such as the andesols and the vertisols for which those factors are less important than actually the parent material. So primarily climate, or if you believe the soil classification system, that's the primary variable.
Anybody else? Yes, Miguel.
Yeah, I thought, Gary, that you ended with a wonderful set of quotes because, the University of California is changing, we all know, and it's not changing in the direction that Hans Jenny and others pointed out. And I was telling Ron before this meeting that I think that for the young generation of faculty and students here to know this legacy that we have here, the agricultural legacy at Berkeley is very, very important. It's very important on the one side because of the public good mission that we have that must not be lost. But it's very important because agriculture and food are becoming major issues for the planet. And we need to revive that because we're part of the Landgrant University still. We're still a public university and we still have that mission. And what else than a tremendous legacy like the legacy of Hans Jenny, as well as the legacy of people in biocontrol like Van den Bosch or Schrock in plant pathology and many other people that did a tremendous amount of important practical work here in California. So I wanted to congratulate the organizers of this meeting, not only for the wonderful presentation, but also for bringing that legacy back and that we need to revive. Thank you.
Well, I agree with that, and of course, and I would add to this that, okay, the problem is tougher now, maybe than Hans even anticipated. Obviously, research has to be funded, and we know what the state's been doing here lately, et cetera. Okay, but that's a conceptual issue. It's not an issue about the mission. My mission is still the same, the public good. Now, that means that I have to finesse the way that funding is done in such a way as to keep that primary in the minds of both those who are providing the funding as well as in the work that's being done. So that's the challenge. But the mission isn't being challenged. That's the thing. People say, well, the mission is trash it because now we have to work for companies or whatever, go where the money is. I don't think that's true. Not only that, but there have been groups for example, in the Strawberry Creek restoration work, we have 600 Berkeley undergrads volunteering their time to help in restoration of Strawberry Creek. They don't get paid a penny for it. They're just doing it because they want to be part of this campus, and it's a way to have a meaningful impact in a very straightforward fashion. That spirit is there, but it's not being tapped in the way perhaps that it could be. And in some sense, this is an appeal to think about that. I mean, this is really true. The people who come off those times of literally pulling the ivy off the sides of the creek, they feel good about what they're doing there, and they do feel rich. Maybe it won't make them rich financially, but it will make the earth rich, and it'll make them rich in another way. So I agree with that. I think that's right. Yes?
Sammy had a great interest in art and the colors of soils and soil profiles throughout history. And I think he had a lecture that he used to give on this, and I wondered if you have that lecture, the lecture slides, if you published it, if you could talk a little bit more about that dimension of the work.
Well, the lecture is available. I made a color copy of the lecture from the proceedings, and it is quite a nice lecture. He had his own favorite paintings, and he loved paintings of road cuts, like the one in Arbor Day. He found one of Cézanne like that, for example, because that shows, and a lot of us in soils know that's where you can easily see a profile without digging. And he talks about that. But what he talks about more and more is, I can't wait to get to Gauguin, because those are the red colors. So he loves the Mediterranean colors of soils above all. And he talks about the cold climates and their kind of gray. Although, you know, Sposito, of which he was majorly responsible for. California, by the way, has 11 of the 12 soil orders. This is an amazingly diverse state, and one of the ways it's diverse is in soils. We have 11 of the 12. The only one we don't have is the permanently frozen soil, I guess, and nobody's found one so far, which you find in the polar regions. But otherwise, we got them all. And a Sposito normally is found in the northeast, and it has this very white, ashen color to it from bleaching in the middle. I think that's amazing and beautiful. And he found one up at the Pygmy Forest. In fact, that's part of the reason for why the forest looks the way it is. And there's an oxysol too, even though that's a form of tropical soil. And he liked those things as well, but I think he really was prone, maybe coming from Switzerland and the German part of Switzerland, he was prone to think about these literally the earth colors, Mediterranean earth palette. That's what he spends a lot of time about. But he also talks about soils being like abstract expressionist painting and so forth. If you're a person into art and the landscape, it's a very nice read. It's very interesting to see. And he was very enthusiastic about these things. The colors, like the first slide showed, they did things to his senses. They made him feel a certain way. I understand that very well. In fact, you can be sensitive to color. Colors, I mean, it's hard to describe in words, but I know what he's saying there when he talks about it. It's a nice one. It's called The Image of Soil in Landscape Art, and it's around. Maybe we should reprint it.
You talk about soils and the senses they evoke within you. Did Hans Yeti or yourself ever participate in geophagy?
He did. He talked about that in his later talks. He said, I eat some soil. Talking about eating soil, right? Yeah, he talked about that. I eat a little soil every day. Yeah, he would say that at the beginning of talk. I remember when he came to Riverside, he said that right at the beginning. He gave a talk about his landscape art, mainly, down there, and he said, well, I eat soil every day. Yeah, he did that. I tend not to do that so much. Like Hans, my family moved from South Central LA to a farm way out in the boonies in Arizona when I was in grammar school. And so I ate a lot of soil unwillingly during that time. I didn't want to eat anymore. But he did. He believed that was a way to have good health. And he lived to be almost 93, just a week short of 93. So he's right. There was another question, Dan? Yeah?
It seems that soil is almost alive in many ways. And in and of itself.
It is alive. It is alive.
No, but I meant separate from the biological.
Oh, okay.
And that, is there or did he talk about it, that in many ways soil almost violates the second law of thermodynamics?
He would never say that.
But in that it sort of creates some kind of order as the process of entropy moves forward, that there's some sort of aspect of it that because of the functioning of an ecosystem, that
Well, those ideas I did not personally hear him express. He was not a mystical person, by the way. I mean, he was not a okay.
In a Picaginian sort of structure way.
Well, he was a classical thermodynamicist. That's what led, as Ron was indicating, led to his equation and so forth. But he didn't tend to see things in terms of open systems like that. That really postdated a lot of his own work and thinking. I don't know, I don't recall anything specific that he said that way about the way soils organize themselves, etc. Not so far as I know. Yeah.
Did he work at the Pygmy Forest for his whole career, or was it the latter part of his career?
Well, when he got here in '36, Charles Shaw, who was the department head, or the head of the soil part, took him up there. So from '36 on, he knew about that place. And Shaw thought it was an amazing place because there were these little trees that were 200 years old or something, and there were giant trees nearby, and clearly there was a soil factor involved. So to him, it was like a Rosetta Stone. He was trying to decipher this thing all of his life. So his California life, yes, I would say he was obsessed by it. In fact, he still had field plots going in the Pygmy Forest when he died. He was still doing that work. And he would go up every weekend in his later life, up there to be up there. I went up there sometimes with him. Couldn't keep up with him, though, of course. As Ron can tell you, too. The guy just moved out. But yes, that's a whole other story that I decided not to tell today. But it's a very interesting story, and that's still unraveling. But he was totally fascinated by that place. It's not just the spotosol, it's a lot more. And it's a situation where a soil has become acidic without there being any acid rain. So it's a natural process. Highly acidic, super acidic.
I'm going to be taking a soil science class for the first time in the fall, and it seems like he had a pretty good message in his handwritten notes. I wonder if I might take a photograph of the pages of his handwritten pages.
What I can do is if you send me an email, I'll scan them and send them to you. I'm happy to do that. That would be the best, I think. Because strictly speaking, I should turn these over to the Bancroft Library, and I want to be careful about doing too much before they know about these things. Well, because they really should have these, not me. Hans Jenny made the first soil map of Switzerland. And a colleague of mine in Switzerland sent it to me, and I immediately went over to the Bancroft with it because I shouldn't keep this. And it's the same thing here. These are treasures, and I want to be careful that the library doesn't feel compromised. If they say it's fine, it'll be fine. But I don't think they can stop me from scanning them at this point. I'm going to give them the advertisement and several other things I have from Hans. I guess I've been saving them all. Right. Well, just write me an email, and I'll send you a scan. Yes?
Yes. To my knowledge, his final transect was Kilimanjaro that he did with Jennifer Martin. Do you know if that work was ever completed? I know he worked for years and years on analysis of the samples he took. Do you know if he ever did anything or published that?
Well, she published on something that was after he died.
We published his work in, we redid some of it, but we published part of it in 2003.
Where?
In Global Biogeography.
Okay, so it is out. Yeah, it's out. She was his last PhD student, of course.
Any other questions? One more.
I was just wondering, do you know if Hans Jenny did any work on the earthworms in soil and what processes they create?
I'm not aware of him paying a lot of attention to soil organisms per se, while recognizing that. But that's all I can say. He never brought them up, let's say. He was focused really on higher plants a lot. He certainly understood that the organisms in soil play a huge role. But again, he was literally obsessed with the Pygmy Forest. And he spent all of his energy trying to sort that out. There weren't a lot of earthworms there.
Any microscopic work of the germules?
Not that I'm aware of. He wasn't a microscope person particularly, as far as I know.
Well, I want to thank all of you for attending. You're invited to a reception right outside in front of Mulford. And I especially want to thank Gary for a fantastic talk.